So that gets us through 1970. From 1910 to 1970, we had the natural monopoly consensus. And then starting in about 1970, weird things started to happen. And this is maybe the final superhero gag in the lecture. This is actually from the original 1970s TV movie of Doctor Strange. But something strange did happen in the 1970s. Let's take a look. But before we go to the 1970s, let's go back in time just a little bit to the 1950s. Oh, no, wait. So there's one more superhero gag. And let's talk about nuclear generation. In the 1950s, nuclear generation technology was born. And what we were able to do is build gigantic nuclear power plants that took advantage of economies of scale. And just a bit of trivia here. I guess the character in X-Men Beast, at least in X-Men lore, his blue skin and blue hair and blue everything is a result of his dad working at a nuclear power plant, which of course is absurd, but whatever. So we built all this nuclear power capacity in the 1950s, and this was as the price was continuing to decline. And the reason that we built so much nuclear power capacity in the 1950s is that electricity demand in the United States was growing exponentially, right? So not linearly, but growing at an even faster rate than that. And there was this expectation that electricity demand was going to continue to grow exponentially. But what in fact happened is that electricity demand, while it continued to grow, the growth rate was actually linear. So electricity demand increased every year on sort of a linear trajectory. In other words, electricity demand was not as high as we expected it to be. So what do you think happened to electricity prices when demand decreased? And remember, this is a monopoly system, not a competitive market where the invisible hand sets prices. Supply and demand and market equilibrium does not apply here. So let's talk about it. So at the time, utilities costs, the cost of providing electricity was really dominated by their mortgage payments on all the power plants that they built. And as a result, as demand decreased, or let's say demand didn't increase as much as they thought it was going to, their costs didn't really go down. So to pay off those debts, the mortgage payments on the power plants on time, utilities required a certain amount of revenues to balance that, right? So let's say that the object of these utilities were to pay their costs and make some sort of modest profit. And to both pay their costs and make this modest profit, they had to collect a certain amount of revenues. So the utilities aimed for their revenues to basically be equal to cost plus the modest profit. So we know that revenues are just equal to the amount of electricity that they sell multiplied by the price at which they sell that electricity. So what happens if they sell less electricity than they thought they were going to? In order to keep the same revenues, they have to increase prices. And this is exactly what happened in the 1970s. At the same time, you had high fuel prices, but one of the major reasons that retail electricity prices began to increase after 60, 70 years of decreasing considerably is that utilities had built too much generation capacities. And electric utility commissions, the public utility commissions in charge of regulating prices, allowed the utilities to increase prices because that was part of the deal. In order for the utilities to maintain strong financial health and low interest rates on the money that they borrowed to build infrastructure, the utility commissions were obligated to allow the utilities to increase prices. So who took the blame here? It was the utility commissions, the state government. The regulators had done a bad job at forecasting electricity demand. They had approved and sometimes ordered the construction of costly nuclear power plants that ultimately were not really needed. And so what happened next had really important implications for the electric power industry, including the advent of renewable energy and the future of the grid. And that's what we're going to talk about next time. Next time, we will discuss the history of the electric power sector, part 2. All right, we'll see you there.